Webster defines crunch time as a critical moment or period, like the end of a game, when decisive action is needed. Every sports fan knows this time in the game. Your palms sweat just a little more, your heart races just a little bit faster, and you live and die with every play until the final seconds tick off the clock and you're either celebrating a victory or disappointed by the defeat. The team at Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network understands just how critical these moments are. For us, it begins as soon as the next set of games are on the board. We evaluate the opening lines and any breaking news throughout the week. We cover each game inside and out, whether it's from inside the locker room to a huddle down on the field, the court, or the ice. We take you inside the meeting room with scouts, coaches, and executives. We have our fingers on the pulse of all the sports that we cover: the National Hockey League, NBA, college basketball, college football, and the National Football League. We are the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network, and we're here to help you find your sports advantage. After all the data has been crunched, we then turn it over to Kenneth for the best analysis around. His unique perspective in both understanding the data and how it applies to the game and how you win is the Crunch Time Sports Advantage. Are you ready? The Crunch Time Jet is fueled and ready for takeoff, and the Crunch Time Express is about to leave the station. Your VIP pass has been approved, so all aboard.
It includes details of the examination, tests, and observations performed, as well as the cause and manner of death. Just like a real autopsy report, the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network College Football Autopsy Report examines a team's body of work after the season has concluded. This report includes a review of the team's season wins total and whether they met expectations, key offensive, defensive, and special teams metrics that shaped the season, a deep dive into coaching decisions, including situational play and fourth down aggressiveness, a final season grade, evaluating execution, performance in key moments, and consistency, the final verdict, analyzing what went right, what went wrong, and what must be fixed for 2025. With the 2024 season in the rearview mirror, it's time to examine the patient. To present the findings, we have called in our chief medical examiner and senior analyst, Kenneth. Coming up in this episode, we will be examining the Houston Cougars. Houston finished with a 4-8 record and 3-6 in the Big 12. Head coach Willie Fritz in his first season with this team after spending the previous 8 years with Tulane. He led the Green Wave to a record of 54-47.
And doing a fantastic job with the lead in. Let's get right to it. Houston Cougars, you are now on the autopsy table. 4-8 last year. We're going to start right there with the betting window. This team had a win total in the summer at 4.5. Fell short of that goal. But when we look at our in-season metrics, those 3 data points that make up our composite win total, we actually had this team a little bit worse. So we only had them at 3.3. So they exceeded our expectations, but our expectations were so low that crossing that bar wasn't as difficult as it would be for many other teams. Now, let's talk about this team from a scheduling standpoint. As we always like to talk about here on these autopsy reports, who did you schedule, and then how did your opponents do? So your strength of schedule, that's what you can control for the most part. This team faced the 6th toughest schedule out of 134 Division I teams last year. Now, as far as their strength of record, how did their opponents do throughout the season? Their opponents had a winning percentage of 57.6%. So 40th out of 134 teams. So not only did they face a difficult scheduling from a power ranking standpoint, their opponents saw a lot of W's go up on the board last year. Now, let's briefly talk about where did we have this team from a power ranking standpoint, an overall ranking standpoint, and then in our Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network playoff committee rankings, how did we see this team? Overall, this team was our 94th rated team out of 134 teams. So you know that's not good. As far as our pure power rankings, they were 72nd. So quite a bit of a jump there. And then in our Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network playoff committee rankings, they were 65th. Okay, let's jump into it like we typically do on these podcasts. We're going to take a look at their offense first. Then we're going to go to their defense, talk about the coaching and special teams, and we'll get you to that final verdict here over the next 20 plus minutes. Okay, let's start right there with the Houston Cougars. If I had to sum up this offense in a bullet point, major struggles in production. When I look at a team that struggled to score points last year, and we'll dive into this a little bit more here in just a moment once we get to the breakdown. The NCAA average last year for offenses was about 28 points per game. Houston was at half of that at 14 points per game. NCAA average total offense about 387 yards per game. Houston was at 288, so almost a full. Actually, it was a full football field difference there. Only 288 yards. That's hard to fathom in this day and age of college football. Yards per play, 5.8 is the NCAA average. They were at 5.5. Let's give some strengths and weaknesses really quickly here before we get into the metrics. Effective rushing game at times. Good red zone execution when they won. Also limited turnovers in their victories. Definitely going to be talking about that here in just a moment. Weaknesses, passing game was one of the worst among the FBS. Really struggled on third downs and poor pass protection. Folks, this team gave up quite a number of sacks last year. So let's get to the breakdown. How good were the defenses did this Houston Cougar offense face last year? 68 Power 4 teams in Division I football currently. So we use that number 68 as a barometer or baseline, I should say, as far as how strong were the opponents that you faced last year. So we're going to look at how many teams that they face inside of that top 68. And if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see that chart up on the screen. If you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, however you may be joining us, thank you so much. Okay, let's count them out. UNLV, 62nd. Oklahoma, number 8 defense. We know Brent Venables will coach some defense. Cincinnati was 31st. Iowa State was 11th. TCU was 53rd. Kansas was 41st. Utah was 12th. Kansas State was 25th. Baylor was 49, and BYU was 23rd. Out of all of their opponents last year, you're talking about only 2 outside of the top 68, and those teams being Rice and Arizona, they weren't that far out. So when we look at an average of their opponents' defensive power rankings, you're talking about an average of about 40. That's telling me you're playing a lot of high caliber defenses there. So it makes sense why this team would have struggled on the offensive side of the ball. So let's get into those numbers now. As I mentioned, 14 points per game is what they average. When we adjust for opponent, that goes up to 17.9. So almost a 4-point improvement there. As far as their passing game, it was anemic, but it did get a little bit better when we adjust for opponent. 152.7 yards per game. When we adjust for opponent, 160.6. So almost an 8-yard improvement there. As far as their rushing game, average 135.4 yards per game. When we adjust for opponent, that goes up to 170.6. about a 35-yard improvement. Total offense goes from 288.1 to a little bit more respectable 331. So almost a 43-yard improvement when we adjust for opponent. Now, I mentioned the inability to score. Their scoring drives, whether it's a touchdown or field goal, 27% of their drives ended with a score. The NCAA average is about 40% last year. Forced their drives ending with a touchdown. NCAA averages about 28.7% of your drives should end with a touchdown. The Cougars were at 19.2. I talked about it struggling on third down. When we adjust that out, instead of the 39%, which is the average, they were at 31. And I talked about giving up a lot of sacks, 32 sacks allowed last year. Folks, that's almost 3 sacks per game. You're not going to have a lot of offensive consistency when you're at that number. And folks, this team committed 27 turnovers last year. 12 ball games, you're well over 2 turnovers per game. When I talk about the 3 E's, how efficient, how explosive, and how efficient were your offense. Remember, 134 teams in Division I football last year. Their effectiveness, they were 129. As far as being explosive, 122. As far as efficiency, they were 120. As far as their offense from last year, this was the 124th rated team for us last year out of 134 teams. Folks, you're talking about a really poor group of 5, soon to be group of 6 team with those metrics. Now, let's flip it over to the defense here. How good were the offenses that this team faced last year? And before I get to that, if I had to sum up their defense, I would say strong, but not enough to offset this poor offense. Let's take a look at some of the strengths I have for the Cougar defense. Strong defensive efficiency, I would say so. They were good on third downs. Did force some turnovers, key turnovers in the wins that they had last year. As far as the weaknesses goes, the offense did not complement the defensive efforts. We talked about that. They struggled against top-tier opponents. Rushing defense showed a lot of inconsistencies, and we're going to bear that out here. So, like I said, using that baseline number of 68, how many teams were inside of that number there as far as the offenses that they faced last year? Going to start with UNLV was 32nd. Oklahoma was 62nd. Wow. Lincoln Riley not being there makes a difference in that offensive number, but still 62nd. Cincinnati, 42nd. Iowa State was 16th. TCU right behind them at 17. Kansas at 23. Kansas State at 29. And Baylor at number 7. And BYU at 41. So 9 of their opponents were inside of that number. So their defense faced some quality opponents. When we averaged that out from a power ranking standpoint, average was about 47.5. So they face some really good competition there as far as their opponents' offenses go. Now, defensive points per game. This defense allowed 22.9 points per game. When we adjust that down, this defense surrendered 18.5, so a 4.4 point per game improvement. Their pass defense, 188.8, is the raw accounting number. When we adjust for opponent, 162, so about a 27-yard per game passing improvement by their defense. Their rush defense was still solid, 136 yards per game. When we adjust that for opponent, they were actually at 127, so 8-yard, almost 9-yard improvement there on the run game. This defense, metrically, they allowed 225 yards per game. When we adjust that for opponent, they were around 289 yards. So a 35 yard per game improvement. I gave you the NCAA averages for these categories. Their scoring defense, whether it was a touchdown or field goal, 30% of their opponents' drives ended with some kind of score, whether it was a touchdown or field goal. As far as their opponents finding the end zone, about 23.4% of their opponents' drives ended with a touchdown. And as far as their third down defense was more than respectable. Their opponents only converted 33.8% on third downs. They did an okay job of getting after the opponent's quarterback. Got to the opponent's quarterback 20 times. That's slightly below the average, but not that far off. Now, as far as forcing turnovers, this team forced 19 turnovers last year. So let's talk about the 3 E's once again. How efficient was this defense? How good was this defense not giving up explosive plays, and how efficient it was? So as far as the effectiveness, they were 29th for us last year. As far as not giving up explosive plays, whether it was in the run game or pass game, they were 27th. And as far as being an efficient defense, they were 28th. This defense was our 25th best defense in college football last year. You got to think if the offense can give them something, they could see some significant improvement. All right, let's talk about the coaching situation and special teams. In one-score games last year, this team was 2-1. That's not bad. Now, versus quality opponents, they were 2-7. Now, here's a problem. -8 in the turnover differential. That was 113th in the FBS last year. Now, this team did not commit a lot of penalties, which is a credit to the head coach there in Willie Fritz. 5.5 penalties per game, only 51, let's round it up, 52 yards of penalties accepted last year. That is absolutely quality stuff there. As far as how aggressive Coach Fritz was last year, out of 144 coaches last year going for it on fourth down, he was 42nd. Now, what does not correlate with that is their conversion rate. 11 out of 29 on fourth downs, 38%. Conversely, their opponents went for it on fourth down 16 times. Their opponents converted 11 of those. That's 69%. Big difference there. Key takeaway, Houston was aggressive on fourth down, but lacked execution, which led to a lot of lost opportunities last year. Now, when we look at their field goal kicking from last year, below average would absolutely describe this team. 10 of 14 on field goal attempts, only about 71% there. As far as yards per punt, about 41.9 yards per punt. Special teams struggle, particularly in field goal consistency. All right, now let's talk about how did this offense look last year how did this team look from an offensive standpoint when they won 8 games when lost? All right, so let's break this out. In the 4 games that they won, the Cougars were scoring 26 points per game. Struggling to throw the ball? Absolutely. Only 16.5 passing attempts per game in the 4 games that they won. 117 yards per game passing, 7.1 yards per attempt, 10 yards per completion. That's not quality there. Now, where they were getting it done was on the ground. 44 rushing attempts when they won to the tune of 198 yards, 4.5 yards per rushing attempt, 315 yards of total offense, 5.2 yards per play. This team run-pass ratio, they were running the ball almost 73% of the time when they won to 27% passing when they won. Only committed 2 turnovers when they won. In the 8 games that they lost, folks, they were averaging 8 points per game. 27 passing attempts per game, 170, let's call it 171 yards per game passing when they lost because they were behind, they were throwing the ball more, 6.4 yards per passing attempt, 10.1 yards per completion. Now, here's the biggest fall off. Only 32 rushing attempts per game when they lost. Only 104 yards per game on the ground, 3.3 yards per carry. But here's the eye-popping number. In those 8 losses, they committed 25 turnovers. So the difference when they won versus when they lost, their offense was scoring about 18 more points per game. They were attempting 10 less passing attempts per game. So this team wants to run the ball under head coach Willie Fritz. When they won, they were running the ball 12 more plays per game, and off of those 12 additional rushing attempts, 94 additional rushing yards per game. We talked about the big difference as far as the turnover battle. Now, let's go ahead and flip it over to the defense here. When they won those 4 games last year, their defense was allowing, let's call it 15 points per game. Their opponents were throwing the ball a lot more, 35.5 passing attempts per game. Only 193 yards passing per game allowed by this defense, 5.4 yards per passing attempt, 9.4 yards per completion. Their opponents were running the ball about, let's call it 26, 27 attempts per game for only 80 yards per game. Folks, 3 yards per rushing attempt. And when this team won those 4 games, they were forcing 10 turnovers. So about 2 turnovers per game is what they were averaging from a defensive standpoint in their 8 losses. This defense was giving up 27 points per game. Their opponents were attempting to pass a lot less, 24 passing attempts per game. Passing yards per game did not go down significantly. 187 yards per game passing, 7.8 yards per attempt, 12.8 yards per completion. Their opponents were running the ball about 39 times per game to the tune of 164 yards per game, 4.2 yards per carry. Now, in the games that they lost, they only forced 9 turnovers compared to the 10 turnovers that they forced when they won. So you can see this team not being able to generate a lot of turnovers when they lost. So to break down the difference between when they lost versus when they won, their defense was giving up about 12 less points when they won, about 6 yards passing when they won, but the defense, they were giving up 84 fewer yards when they won. And we talked about the turnover differential, just astronomical as far as that goes. Okay, so what went wrong for the Houston Cougars in 2024? We talked about it. Ineffective, I should say, passing game, could not sustain drives. And where that really bears out is they couldn't settle in on a quarterback, whether it was Donovan Smith or Zion Chris. Both quarterbacks saw significant action. Neither quarterback could stop from turning the ball over. Both quarterbacks threw for about 800 yards passing. Both quarterbacks had 4 touchdowns, but both quarterbacks also had 8 interceptions each. So you're talking about 8 touchdowns to 16 INTs. You're not going to win many games when you have that kind of touchdown to INT ratio. They also committed too many turnovers. I talked about it being -8 in the turnover battle. Hard to win games when you're giving your opponents more opportunities than you will have. And then finally, inability to score in key moments. That was a significant problem for this team in 2024. All right, let's get to the final grade for the Houston Cougars. The Houston Cougars 2024 autopsy report final grade will be a C-. Reason for that? As far as the strength, defense was competitive. Situational play in close games, also a positive. Coaching aggressiveness in fourth downs, good. Execution, not so much. Poor offensive production was a weakness, struggled against quality teams, and turnover issues. Final verdict, Houston had a strong defense, played aggressively, but lacked offensive production and execution prevented them from achieving a better record. What are the three things that this team must do in 2025 if they want to improve that win-loss record? First and foremost, the offensive scheme and play calling has to get better by head coach Willie Fritz. Key number 2, they must limit the turnovers and increase their efficiency. And then the third key, they must find a consistent passing attack, whether it's recruiting or the transfer portal, but you cannot go into 2025 with these two quarterbacks playing the way that they did last year. You got to bring in some kind of competition to really spark this offense in 2025. If the Cougars improve in these three areas, the Houston Cougars can return to bowl contention in 2025.
Thank you for tuning into this podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and our deep dive into all things college football. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You can follow us on Twitter at CrunchTimeVIP for updates, insights, and more content. And make sure to visit our website at CrunchTimeSportsAdvantage.com for in-depth blogs, game previews, and information about our Crunch Time Express handicapping packages. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time for our next patient on the 2024 College Football Autopsy Report.